As with all wars, children are some of the most heartbreaking victims. They witness atrocities, are pulled from their homes, and sometimes, of course, are killed. Dave Toycen from World Vision Canada is just back from Lebanon's Bekaa Valley, and while there, he witnessed firsthand the plight of Syria's refugee children. And Dave joins us now to tell us more about what he saw. It's always good to have you here at TVO. One day we'll have you in and talk about something happy, but at the moment, It doesn't appear to be the case. Tell us a bit about where you were in Syria.
Well, I was in the Bekaa Valley, which is about an hour and a half from Beirut. It's a beautiful region, although in the wintertime it's kind of barren, but there's mountains and it's a long valley. And so what's happened is the refugees coming in from Syria, there aren't specified camps for them. They're really left to their own devices to a certain extent, just to find somewhere, a basement, a garage, in some cases a piece of land, and then you put or a piece of space rather, and you put up a shack, and that's where people live. And so these are people, I would say most of them are not really poor people. They're people who've worked, who've had jobs, who have homes, and so suddenly they're just thrown into this nightmare where they don't know, where their next meal's coming from, and they're refugees in a country that's neighboring to them, and really none of them want to be there.
And basically left everything behind in Syria?
Absolutely. In many cases, the dad is not with them. A couple of instances, both parents, and it was a grandmother looking after the children.
Let's focus on that. I want to focus laser-like on the situation with the children there, and you spoke to many. How old were most of the kids you spoke to?
Oh, they ranged from high school students, high school age, teenagers to 4 and 5. At World Vision, we actually did a survey of about a focus group of 60 kids and then 40 interviews and 12 different households to get a sense of what their feelings were. And it was interesting. We kind of broke it into 3 categories. Most obvious one was they're really upset that they're not in school. Some of them have been able to go to schools in Lebanon, but there's not enough space for them. The other issue was just the stability, just not knowing whether they're going to stay where they are. And then lastly, it was just the anxiety that this creates. Many of them had seen violence. In some cases, they'd seen people killed, and in a few cases, people that were their family members had been killed in front of their eyes.
So you talked to orphans as well, presumably?
Yeah, well, these were people, they still had some family members, but they had very powerful experiences.
Any guess at how many Syrian refugees there would be in Lebanon today?
Well, when I was there, 3 weeks ago, it was 170,000. The latest number we're getting now is 200,000, and 100,000 of those are children.
100,000 kids?
Yes.
And in the Bekaa Valley where you were, how many?
Oh, that's basically where most of them are. Maybe another, 15 or 20,000 are scattered in other places, but the Bekaa Valley is really where most of them are.
And just to confirm, because a lot of the places that you have gone to in the past in other countries and then come and talk to us about, there are formal refugee camps with tents and UN observers and so on. Any of that happening here?
No,
nothing.
Not. Part of the reason, the Lebanese government, I think, or Lebanon government needs to be commended that they've been open, obviously, to accept these folks. But they're really worried that people will stay indefinitely. And I think there's an estimated something like 600,000 Palestinian refugees who've been in Lebanon for years. And so they don't want to encourage Syrian refugees to stay. So that's why people are living wherever they can find space.
Are the living conditions tolerable in the short run?
Well, it really depends on what kind of space you have. The other issue is it's very critical that you get registered with the UN Agency for Refugees, UNHCR. And if you do that, then you're given $30 a month per person, per child, for food. So that gives you something, plus some relief supplies. But there's an estimated 15% that are not registered for various reasons. We can go into that. And then the other issue is that aren't registered, but the other issue, there's a delay. I was speaking with the communications person at UNHCR, and they were saying at average it's taking about 3 months to register a family. So they got a 3-month gap depending on if they had any money when they came out of the country, what was their situation, or they're completely on their own. And that what we've been doing at World Vision has been trying to deal with some of the gap, the people that don't qualify right away. And so that's where we're providing relief supplies, emergency food. But compared to what their life was like in Syria, this is like camping out
Well, it's gotta be
for a long time. And it's
infinitely-
winter time.
Yeah.
They've had heavy snows, unusual snows. And we went in many places where the little stoves they had or whatever, they didn't have fuel for it.
So people are cold.
Oh, yeah.
They need
people are
blankets.
really-
They need
oh,
everything.
absolutely.
Generators, whatever.
Yeah.
You mentioned in the middle of that answer there's a bunch of people who are not registered.
Yeah.
Why would that be?
Well, the issues around, for example, it could be people, say, of a particular faith or one of the groups, one of the minority Muslim groups, or say Christians, who are worried, and this would be true even of others from the major groups, they're worried that somehow if they have relatives back there, the fact that they've bailed out of the country and left will somehow have some sort of implication. And then also, if they go back, depending on what government's in place, it could be held against them that they've left the country.
So better to lay low.
Better to lay low, that's right.
You mentioned also, and another thing I wanted to follow up on, a lot of the kids you talked to missed being in school.
Yes.
How are they being educated while they're in Lebanon?
Right. Well, some of the things that are happening in terms of World Vision, we're providing just what we call child-friendly spaces. These would be for the youngest children, almost like preschool, and maybe at most first grade, just a place where they can play. There's food provided, encouraged drawing, anything maybe perhaps to get out their feelings. And so it's a positive, sort of happy place, singing, so forth. And then we've also have, for the older children, it's basically kind of a remedial where they're getting basics of numbers and alphabet and some language, just so that they're not completely out of an educational system. So we're only doing that for a few thousand when the need is huge, but that's what we're trying to do, at least make a difference where we are.
You did a report at World Vision about the Syrian refugees called the Paradox of Invisibility, and I want to read a little excerpt of that right now, and then we'll get a question coming out of that. Here's the quote. "The paradox of invisibility sits at the heart of the vulnerability faced by Syrian refugees in Lebanon. The real number is believed to be as much as 30% higher than the official registered number. By registering, families can access food, clothing, shelter, and healthcare assistance, among other things. Registration also helps the local government and humanitarian community keep track of aid and identify emerging needs. Despite this, many families do not register as refugees." And we just talked about why that's not happening. But is anybody trying to encourage these people to sign up and get registered, lest they have nothing in the short run? I appreciate the long run concerns, but what about now?
Right. No, that's definitely the case. For example, I know the UNHCR, for example, is sort of having mobile places where they're moving around. They say they have 540 sites that they're covering. You can imagine what that's like for an agency. So that's being done. We're certainly encouraging it. And I think we'll see more and more refugees signing up. I think that's true. But there still will be people that won't. And so, it seems in some ways counterproductive to us, obviously, from our point of view. But at the same time, you have to do something. So we're determined to keep reaching out to them. They've got children that are in need, and we can't just leave them be. We have to help them.
How many families can your organization alone, help in the area right now?
Well, right now we're doing just over 7,000, but we'd like to do 14,000. And frankly, that's the challenge for us, because we just don't have the resources right now. So one of the reasons I went to Lebanon was to say, how can some firsthand reporting hopefully gain some increased support? And it has done that so far, but we're still a long way from what we need.
And for that group of 7,000 families, what are you specifically actually doing?
Well, basically, we are a distributor for the World Food Program, so it's providing food, basically enough food for a child or an adult for a month, and they get those distributions every month, so we're doing those distributions. Things like blankets, helping with stoves and the fuel for stoves, and then some basic, many come with very little, so in terms of cooking utensils, hygiene, toilet paper, very basic, simple things that families need. And then the other issue is doing everything we can to facilitate, if they need medical care, they're able to go somewhere and get some medical treatment. That's the other thing that's critical, because we're really concerned about the young children, because they get cold, they're exposed. You see their hands are just red because in many cases they don't have mittens or gloves of any kind. So we've actually been able to bring at least some supplies in for clothing. In the group the group of us that were in, we brought some, just what we could find with us, and distributed it to every family that we visited. And it was wonderful to see these kids warming up, because it's that exposure that where they get coughs, and then that turns into pneumonia, and there's a real spiral. And that's the real concern. Even when I was there, it was already getting cold, but we did not see snow and what we're dealing with right now. So I think the concerns around the little children and, say, infants, that's our greatest concern right now.
I know you guys are a humanitarian organization and you like to avoid the politics, but I'm going to sneak a little political question in here.
Right.
Lebanon used to be a much more Christian country than it is today. It's obviously not a very Christian country, demographically speaking, anymore. And I wonder whether your organization runs into any problems as a result of that.
No, not really. I mean, actually, there's still, I think it's something like 40-60 in terms of the percentage. So there's actually quite a large...
Christian Muslim, 40-60?
Yeah. So and I would say they've learned to get along with each other. Obviously, there's been,
25 years of civil war might make that happen.
That's exactly right. And obviously, there's still lots of tension. But I mean, they've learned to get along with each other. So no, we really haven't experienced difficulty in that way. I think so much of it depends upon what you're doing, and that you're doing it. There's no strings attached. You're simply there to help people.
And the government knows you're there, and is,
oh yeah, absolutely,
and is fine with you being
We've
there.
We've been there for a long time. I think over 30 years. So, and we've been through the hard times there and the better times.
So you're helping 7,000 families. You want to help 14,000 families, and obviously that means you want help from the Canadian people. So what do you want them to do?
Well, basically, we need funds. We need money, and basically, it's just get to our World Vision Canada website. It's worldvision.ca, and it's very clear what you can do right there. And I just, the comment is, these are really simple things that people need. One of the family situations that was particularly moving for me, it was the last interview we did, and it was a lady who was there with 3 of her children. Her husband was still back in Syria, protecting what property they had left. And they clearly were family he had a small business, and they had a reasonable life. But she was depressed. She was pregnant, 7 months pregnant. She had 3 children. She had borrowed money from people locally. She was running out of food. And the part that was just heartrending for us, because I was with a couple of our women's staff as well, is that she was getting ready. She had a 13-year-old daughter, and she was getting ready to marry her off.
Oof.
And we asked her, well, why would you do that? And she said, well, I think the roughly $600 of dowry would probably cover all of our current debts and help us. And she turned to her and she said, she's my savior.
What did the 13-year-old have to say about this?
Well, she was very glum and unhappy. And so the good news about this is we really engaged with her and said, do you know what you're doing? We're here to see if we can provide some more help. And so before it was over, we had her assurance that she would not do that. But it was she was depressed, but once we talked through that, we saw the first smile on her face that we had seen while we were there. So
let me pick up on that, because every time you visit this studio, it's usually to tell us about some godforsaken part of the world. You forgive me for using that kind of language, but it feels that way. But you never fail to leave us with a bit of an uplifting message about some young child who did something to make you feel okay. We're having an impact. Leave us with something like that.
Well, I still have a photograph in my head, and it was her name was Rama. She was 10 years old, and she lived with her grandmother and would be her auntie, because both her parents, for some extenuating circumstances, were still back in Syria. And they were in a room not much larger than your table with all these kids, 9 girls and 1 boy, and teenagers down to, the youngest was about 2, I think. And they're living in there. They had a little stove in the middle. Now the good thing is they had plenty of blankets, but the stove, no fuel for the stove. And so we were talking, and her auntie was one of the most articulate people that we talked to. And she talked about the fear they had gone through. They were worried that the girls were going to be raped because they were invaded once in their home and managed to push the soldiers out. So they left at that point. But this 10-year-old girl, Rama, 2 of the girls were able to get into school, but she wasn't able to. And she was drawing. And I went over and looked, and for 10 years of age, she was really talented. And so she had drawn a picture of a fish, but it was done in beautiful colors, freehand drawing. And so I was talking with her, and I said, "This is beautiful. How do you do this?" And she, like most artists, just smiled at me, wasn't going to tell me her secrets. And I was looking at her different drawings, but the fish one was on. I said, I want to tell your story back in Canada. Would you give me maybe one of your drawings? I was kind of hoping for the fish because that was the one I liked best, but I didn't say. And that was the one she pulled out and gave to me. And it's just an example of kids telling their story. And she's talented. So we actually did some talking with our staff and said, is there some way we can get her in school? Because she really has a future, as an artist. And but once again, in the middle of all the disaster and all the difficulties, talking to her about her artwork, big smile on her face, and just a reminder again that children are resilient, and if we can be there to provide just a little bit of help, they'll survive, and they've got great hope for the future.
Great. Your study is on our website, and before long, I'd like to get a JPEG of that fish and have that up on our website too. I want to see that picture of the fish.
Great.
Dave Toycen, we always appreciate your visits here. Thanks so much. President, CEO, World Vision Canada.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.